Okay, good evening, everyone. Good evening. I hope everyone has had a good day on today. Today is definitely a good day if you're still here. If you haven't had a mental breakdown, if you haven't had a panic or anxiety attack, today is definitely a good day. I know we've all still have been dealing with this COVID crisis and all of the things that have been going on. But tonight we are going to be digging a little bit deeper into our um, conversation that we had last week on putting the pieces of the puzzle together. We're putting the puzzle back together. And I believe that a lot of us have been dealing with some things, and it's crazy that, you know, we've all have been in this rat race for the past 4 or 5 months dealing with COVID and all that has come with it. But I'm just believing that there are some people here um, that are definitely ready and willing to help us on tonight. Last week we had my friend, one of my best friends. He's like a best friend. He's like an older brother to me. He's an older brother from another mother, but he's definitely a friend. Mr. Patrick Bordnick, the Dean of Social Work at Tulane University. And on tonight, we have another great person who's going to join us on tonight, Dr. Deidre Hayes, who's also one of his colleagues at Tulane, and also she was my therapist for a little while, and y'all, she helped me through one of the darkest times in my life. But I'm not going to let them talk. I'm not going to talk for them too much. I'm going to allow them to talk for themselves. But y'all, do me a favor when you come on. Let's like, let's share, let's tag, and let's get this conversation on the road, because I believe that there are some people that really need to have this conversation concerning mental health, and not only concerning mental health, but tonight we're going to deal with mental health, and we're going to touch on social injustice. So y'all, it's going to be a very um, I'm not going to say controversial, but it's definitely going to be a very awakening conversation on tonight. How we deal with social injustice as well as dealing with mental health at the same time. So I would like to introduce to you on tonight Dr. Patrick Bordnick as well as Dr. Deidre Hayes. How are you guys doing on tonight?
Just fine, just fine. It is a beautiful evening.
As well as Dr. Deidre Hayes. How are you guys doing on tonight?
Just fine, just fine. It is a beautiful evening.
As well as Dr. Deidre Hayes. How are you guys doing on tonight? That might be Mr. Patrick.
Just fine, just fine. It is a beautiful evening.
As well as Dr. Deidre Hayes. Hello?
Hey.
Okay, can you hear me, Mr. Patrick?
Yeah, I can hear you. I was getting a little feedback. I started a watch party on Facebook, and there was a delay, so I hear Dr. Hayes saying just fine, and it keeps going back and forth. And I wasn't sure who I was talking to, but glad to be here. Thank you. I'm honored to be on the show, and also with a colleague and a friend, Dr. Hayes. So welcome everybody.
So, as I stated earlier, welcome to these two doctors. Both of them deal with social work and other fields that they deal with. And y'all, last week's conversation with Dr. Borden, it was a very interesting conversation dealing with mental health and certain issues. And I thought it was very befitting that he said some of the things that he said, and he doesn't even know. I didn't reach out to him and tell him, but there was definitely some positive feedback on the information that was given last week. So thank you, Dr. Bordnick, for being very informative, especially in the talk concerning the webpage for Tulane and all of the resources that you guys have on the webpage. I have yet to sit down and look at it. I may actually look at it tonight once I get off of this live. Probably have me a glass of wine and go through this, and probably go tour one of these museums that you were talking about. Um, but we thank you for that information. Y'all, Dr. Hayes, she is definitely um, she is definitely God sent, y'all. As I stated earlier, She was there in one of the roughest times of my life, y'all. I had lost my grandmother, and I was getting ready to, and I was actually going through a divorce. And she really helped me through that time outside of prayer. You know, sometimes we still have to go sit down with someone and talk, because I believe, yes, God can help you, but I believe God has equipped some people on the earth that have some information that can help you move forward. And in these times that are going on, these times where people are dealing with anxieties and stresses, depressions, and all of these other mental issues that have been going on, I believe that it's going to be imperative within, I want to say, the next year or two, that some people are going to have those moments of detoxification, and they're going to have to sit on the couch or sit in a chair and have a conversation. Because I'm not speaking for myself, but I know a lot of people that this pandemic has played a lot of, it has played on their mind, it has weighed on their mind a lot. And not only the pandemic, but then we're dealing with the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and some other social issues that have been going on. So the climate has been really heightened at this time. So I guess for a starter question, I would actually start a question on dealing with, we're going to deal with social injustice, but yet still deal with mental health. So with, as high as this climate is going on, how do people deal with the anxieties of having not only to deal with COVID, but have to deal with some of these social matters that are going on? How do you deal with those things
Well,
mentally?
that is such a long, that's like a broad question, but I'm going to start back with COVID. One of the things that I have been doing a lot through COVID is watching funerals. And for some reason, they give me comfort. I watched George Floyd's funeral from beginning to end. Um, and for some reason, it just gave me great comfort. And one of the things that was said in the funeral was that, by Al Sharpton, was that the reason why we were able to acknowledge what happened to George Floyd was because of COVID. And if it were not for COVID stopping all sports and stopping people going to work and stopping traveling, we would not have been sitting down looking at the television and seeing what happened to George Floyd and actually being able to sit through that 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So that COVID allowed us to see that injustice and to really, I think, appropriately deal with the fact that we have been dealing with these injustices for decades, of course, but not necessarily taking the time to deal with it. So to answer your question, I think that sometimes anxiety is not a bad thing. Sometimes anxiety can be a good thing. And to feel is a good thing, to feel feelings. So if people are having anxiety about what happened to George Floyd, that is normal and natural. And, sometimes we have to be in our feelings, as some people say. Um, how do we how do we cope with it and adjust to it? I think looking at ways that we can possibly be a part of the solution, looking at ways that how we can be a part of the movement if we so want to be a part of the movement, but then also looking at ways that we can educate ourselves about what's going on, about the history of America, where we have been, where we would like to see us go as Americans. I think all of those things can be very helpful. But then the other thing we can do is to turn the television off. That's part two, because looking at it too much can cause too much anxiety. So that when you feel like you've had enough, turn the television off, turn music on, talk to your loved ones, hug your loved ones, and try to enjoy your day.
It, it's funny that you say enjoy your day, because it seems like COVID has forced people to now um, communicate without having to deal with your phones or social media now. And it also has opened up different avenues for families to connect now. I know, Zoom stock was maybe $10, and once COVID came, Zoom stock went up to almost $200+. But you have more people using Zoom now. I know my family uses Zoom for, like, we do a family prayer every Saturday when we get on, we check in, we let each other know how we're doing. And that has actually, I'm noticing that it has actually brought the family a whole lot closer. We
Mhm.
become more cohesive because of this. So it's almost as if COVID was almost like a blessing in disguise for some people, because it's teaching them how to do things without having to deal with the hustle and bustle of everyday life. You know, as I said last week, one of the things that I told me and Mr. Patrick, Dr. Bordnick were talking about was the fact that now people have been forced to stay home, and
Mhm.
so the things that they've swept under the rug, or the things that they haven't dealt with in times past, now you're forced to have to deal with it, because now you have nothing but space, time, and opportunity to deal with those problems. So that definitely was awesome what you're saying. We've had the chance now to look and watch things and see what's really going on. Because
Mhm.
had COVID not come, would there have been such a outpour, or would there have been such a movement concerning George Floyd's death?
Right. Exactly. And
And
it's a global movement. It's not just in the United States, it's all over the world. And part of that is because COVID happened all over the world.
right. So with that happening, with and I guess we looking at the George Floyd thing. Do you believe? I know we say that anxieties can be good, but do you think that may have caused some bad anxieties in the world concerning people and their mindset concerning protection, be it the police or personal protection, some other things?
Absolutely. I think part of what could have happened with that, with the George Floyd issue as well, is people being triggered, people who been have had trauma as it relates to the police or any other authority figure for that matter, may have been triggered by that instance. And so sometimes when people have trauma triggers, um, it can definitely cause severe anxiety. Um, and that's when we go back to, you have to turn the television off. You have to. But then you also, depending on how severe the reaction is, you might need to seek help or counseling, or even if it's talking to a loved one or reaching out to friends and talking to friends about the feelings that you are having, as it relates to that kind of trauma trigger. I think, especially those of us who live in New Orleans, sometimes we get to a point where certain things happen and we're into such acceptance, or we bury it, so to speak. And we try not to pay attention to it, or we, we accept that, oh, that's just the way it is. And then when something like George Floyd happens, all of those feelings come out. And as I stated earlier, those feelings can be used for good, like, to really go out and become a part of the movement. In New Orleans, it was amazing to see the amount of people who were out having protesting and really, moving towards change in the city of New Orleans. And it was beautiful to see. And part of that was because people were so angry, so that's a part of what happens when those kinds of things happen, when those things happen. The other side of that is that I've also heard that more people are buying guns, and more people are feeling like they need to protect themselves. And unfortunately, that could prove not to be such a healthy response to the trauma. Um, One more thing to add is that in New Orleans, I've seen, and I don't know, we don't know if there's a true correlation. But the murder rate in New Orleans has increased significantly over the last, I want to say, 2 months. And it causes me to wonder if it has to do with the anxieties and the stress and the struggles of COVID and the whole George Floyd thing.
That was the one thing. Well said, Dr. Hayes. The one thing that struck me when we moved to New Orleans like 4 years ago, and I've actually talked to Dr. Hayes about this, was that idea of accepting certain things. We moved here from Houston, and things that weren't acceptable there, it was almost as if people just, in a sense, accepted certain things. And I'm like, this isn't acceptable, but I think when something occurs over and over again, we almost become numb to it. And that's the point where we need to stop and regroup and say, no, this isn't acceptable. People killing each other, or police brutality, or racism or sexism, these are never acceptable. And we always need to stand up and never accept that. And we've had long talks about this. And I think what we're seeing now is people are reevaluating the world as well as their own. Hopefully it's a time that we all need to reflect upon our own biases and implicit and how we view the world, because where each and every one of us has our own set of how we view the world. And I think this is a good time to reflect, and an inflection point for the world to say, we need to stop accepting these things that are totally unacceptable, go towards kindness, go towards humility, go towards acceptance. And I hope and I pray that this is the time that when you see signs at the protest that say, I've had the same sign that I had in the 60s. And, that really says something. We've come a certain way, but damn it, we've got so much more to go. And I think that's an important thing to think about, is now's the time to reflect, but also to act.
It is crazy. I just was reading something, and according to the New York Times, it says about 2 million guns were sold in the U.S. as the virus was feared to spread, dealing with COVID. And I can't even lie myself. I just actually bought 2 guns myself, because of the rise. And I'm not going to say it was based off of, I'm not going to completely say it wasn't based off of fear, but more or less just, I guess, a precautionary for protection. And I think a lot of people have done that on that scope as a form of protection. And a lot of people have definitely bought it out of fear. So that definitely has been something that has been done. But you said something, Dr. Hayes, and I wanted to ask you that question. And you said something about it. You said trauma triggers. What are trauma triggers? Because I know outside of, you said murder or death, what are trauma triggers? Because I'm more than sure a lot of people may need some help with identifying or understand what's trauma triggers. And then maybe someone doesn't know what a trauma trigger is, and they may be dealing with something and didn't know that it was something that was affecting them in the way that it is.
Well, the one thing I can say about trauma is that all of us have had traumas. Everybody, if we're on this earth and of age, everyone has experienced a trauma. We deal with traumas in different ways. Some of us deal with traumas in healthy ways. Some of us try to bury those traumas, or we never actually process through the feelings that those traumas actually, that the traumas bring out. And what happens is that one little thing can bring all of those feelings back up again. So you might have one little thing that happens, and you say, "Oh my God, that reminds me of that." Or in some cases, you don't even know that that's what reminds you of that. You just see that your behavior changes, or your feelings change, or you might become depressed, or you might become angry, or more aggressive with people, and not really recognizing that something familiar or something has brought out these feelings based on something that has happened to you in the past. So if you had a death of a loved one, And sometimes what happens is, like, every year around the anniversary of the death of that person, you may behave differently, or you may become really depressed. And you don't realize that that anniversary is a trauma trigger. The anniversary of your loved one's death is a trauma trigger. Um, so understanding that we all have traumas, that is a normal part of life. We all deal with our traumas in different ways. That's also normal. But then, we all have things that may remind us of those traumas. And then how we deal with that can be different as well.
Dr. Bordnick, if you have anything to say.
Take yourself
Or mute.
So used to unmuting and muting myself. It's interesting you bring up the guns situation. We were I'm actually personally afraid of guns. I've shot one in my life, and it was with a DEA agent that I knew, and he said, he allowed me to shoot it. And I literally took one shot and handed it back to him and said, I just don't feel comfortable with the human being having this much force.
Mm-hmm.
It literally freaked me out. Although, my wife's family come from a long line of people that would hunt for food. That's how they fed their families. I mean, so it was a part of her life and her background. And we were in a store recently in town, and we went up and we were buying, the most simplistic thing. I think it was some soccer cleats, some shorts, some things like that. And up at the counter was a sign that one of my daughters said to me, "They're out of ammo." And I was like, "What are you talking about, out of ammo?" And it was literally listing that they were out of all kinds of ammo. And they started asking me, like, why would they be out of ammo? And I did the thing, and I believe in honesty with our kids. And I kind of said, people are feeling afraid.
Mm-hmm.
People, this is one way. Well, why would they get a gun? Why does that make them feel safe? And it, quite frankly, is, I wasn't sure of how to respond. I don't have all the answers. And I just said, well, some people think a gun makes them feel safe. And it's very hard for me to kind of have that conversation with my kids because I don't understand. I understand why some people may want a gun. But then I'm also faced with the senseless murders and killings, and also looking at police brutality and people getting shot unjustly. And that's hard to talk about with your kids, because how do you explain hatred? How do you explain these things? How do you explain that you see a police officer? And there are a lot of great police officers out there, but there are, like in any profession, some that are bad, that have murdered people unjustly. And, it's explaining that. So I think it re-traumatizes every time we see these things on the news. And, you look at something like CNN. Literally, it is almost a COVID-19 pandemic. It looks like the stock market. It is a death ticker, and it's constantly showing this. If you watch that, and I personally stopped watching the news years ago, and I will dial in every once in a while on my phone and just look at some headlines, just so I can stay somewhat informed, that I literally turn off the TV, because it's this constant negative, and re-traumatizing people, no matter what it could be, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a murder, whether it's racism. We're not getting a lot of positive things in our lives, and that can really wane on us. No wonder why we're all exhausted. We're dealing with, the pandemic and going grocery shopping. I shared with Fortna last week that it's like Mortal Kombat. You're afraid that you're going to get sick at the grocery store and die. You may see your neighbor there, and you want to walk up and hug them, because we're huggers in New Orleans, right? But you sort of like stepping back, saying that's not a safe thing to do. That's not, and I don't like to use the word normal. That's not how we normally live, as especially in New Orleans. And that personal connection's been taken away from us, and we're dealing with trauma and historical based trauma, and all types of things. This is building up, and it's not going to lead to good things for people in our communities across the country and around the world.
Yeah. We actually had 2 road rage murders in the last week in New Orleans.
Oh,
2,
wow.
yes. So it is something that we need to really be aware of. I am a proponent of gun control, but hey, that's just my own view because I'm like Patrick. I'm afraid of guns and I don't believe in guns. And I believe in, solving problems through, talking to people and actually trying to resolve issues in a nonviolent way. But that's just my way, you know. And so we have to be really cautious as we look at people, as we talk to people about this conversation, because so many people believe, that Second Amendment right is their right, and they get really upset about it. But when and how is the appropriate time to carry a gun? Is having a gun when you're out drinking a good time to have a gun? That's a good question.
No, I think that's a great question, Dr. Hayes. It's, you know, having a gun and having that is a lot of responsibility. You are dealing with a piece of equipment, whatever you want to call it, that in a split second can take a life.
Yes.
And I don't know too many people that I feel comfortable with that responsibility. I'll be honest. It scares me. I don't have any guns in my house. My immediately family don't have guns. I do have friends that have guns, and we have talks about them, and I understand why they have them. I don't have to agree with them, but I understand their need that is some sort of level of safety for them. But everyone has their own personal choices. But I'm with you that I don't understand why someone would need to carry a gun in their daily life unless you are, working for a bank or you have a reason where you may need that to protect whatever, or you are law enforcement, But again, having that gun, does that then stop us from doing what you do very well, Dr. Hayes, is conflict negotiation and reason in de-escalating situations? It's so easy to get upset, pull out a gun and pull the trigger. And a lot of times when you see that happening and you hear from the person, I didn't mean to do it, it just happened.
Right.
Well, yeah, that's a lot of that you're not responsible enough to have that gun because it is something that can take a life. It's not like throwing a rock at someone and giving them a bruise. It's killing them. And you err towards that in the heat of the moment versus talking to someone, which I find very interesting. People are so afraid to talk to someone and de-escalate or even show vulnerability. I every time I talk and go on to programs like this, I always try to be vulnerable, hoping that I can model that behavior for others. It's okay. It's not being weakness. Actually, being vulnerable is one of the most powerful things you can do. And de-escalating a situation means you are more of a person and a stronger person than pulling out a gun and shooting someone or resulting to violence. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Dr. Hayes?
Well, I'm interesting that you said that because, of course, I watched John Lewis's funeral today, and that's the one thing that resonated throughout the funeral was that nonviolence, nonviolent confrontation, nonviolent protest, nonviolent ways of communicating and conflict resolution, and this was how he lived his life. And as you stated earlier, it may not be right for everybody, but he was able to accomplish a lot by having that as his philosophy in life and having that as a value for him in life. So yes, I absolutely agree with that. I would just like to add I'm going to switch back to the gun conversation for 1 second, because I would just like to say to parents that if you do have guns in your household, please make sure they are locked and that they are safely put away. If you have kids who you have concerns about, please, it is okay for you to go through their room and check to make sure that they do not have a weapon. And I just had to say that because I tell my parents that all the time that I work with. Parents want to give their children privacy and all of that. But it's okay to give your children privacy to a point. But if you are concerned about your child, feel free, even if it's with that said child, to go through their room and make sure that they are safe and you are safe. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Quantika Nashan posted, honestly, guns aren't the problem. Bad people with guns are the problem. And Latasha Marie said, I'm glad that we're talking about trauma. Often people think that they are not traumatized by the actions or things going on around us. Everyone is affected. I know we went to the guns thing. And Quantica said, honestly, guns aren't the problem. Bad people with guns are the problem. Let me ask this question. When we're dealing with mental health issues, we're dealing with stress and anxieties, do we feel that may be something that is actually harming people concerning like this gun control and all of those other things? Because not everyone is bad. Could it be that someone may be dealing with stress, anxiety, or depression, and they don't have anyone to talk to, so they result in doing something that is harmful to somebody else instead of just having that, I guess, as Martin would say on Bad Boys, that woosah moment before they act?
Well, I think Patrick said it earlier when he said that, some people who execute use of a firearm will then turn around and say, I didn't mean it. Not all people who shoot are bad people. Some people who shoot have bad judgment. Some people who shoot have bad tempers. Some people who shoot are just plain afraid. So you have all of those things to account for in terms of how and when people shoot, not just the fact that they're bad people. And so the consequences, though, are far-reaching for individuals in gun use. So that would be my answer to that. Yes, mental illness has a lot to do. I mean, people who have mental illness, people who have anxiety, people who have stress, who have guns, they may be at a greater risk for themselves and or others with that gun, which is why the gun should be locked up. If you have a gun, lock your gun up. Be like, I don't know if y'all used to watch Andy Griffith, but Barney Fife only had one bullet and he didn't keep it in the gun.
Oh, I think now I'm remembering that. I think that's right. The guns themselves aren't bad. I think it's, if someone needs a gun and if it's out of fear or whatever, I think before going out, and again, I'm not here to lobby or legislate guns or no goods or amendments or this. I think question, what do you need that gun for? What is the purpose that it's serving? If you're fearful, is the gun going to solve your fear? If you're fearful for your life, okay, what is a gun going to do to fix that? Is it going to just, in the interim, I really think exploring why you need a gun, what's the point? And I'm sure for some individuals, there are very valid reasons and they will end up getting a firearm. I don't think that's a question. I think people really need to take that step. It's so easy to get a gun now, legally or legally, in this country. But I think it's really questioning why you have it. My grandfather was a cab driver back when we had cabs, way back when. And it wasn't safe a lot of time, and it was in Pittsburgh. And I know he had a gun, and it was for his personal protection because several cab drivers had been killed. So, whether I agree with why he had the gun or not, I could understand his logic. I don't know if it made him any safer, and so I think that's, figuring out why people are going towards a gun and what purpose is it serving for them. And I'm not judging whether it's their personal choice. You can have a gun in this country, But I think really understanding, more importantly, if you do have one, what is your responsibility to yourself, to others, to, like Dr. Hayes had said, to your family? That thing is locked up. Kids do not think like we do. They are going to do things even more impulsively and end up possibly hurting themselves or their others. And that's, again, talk about trauma and
Right.
lifelong issues. I think that's a great point, Dr. Hayes.
With all this, with the way this social climate is going on, could I ask this question? And I know this gonna probably be one of those that we may have touched on, but I think it's something that is is touchy at this time. Do you feel like with what's been going on with the killings of innocent Black people, or anybody that's innocent that has been killed by the police, it has heightened mental health in the United States because of the feeling of more or less vulnerability or that lack of protection?
Can you repeat that one, please?
Like, based on what's been going on, the way the social climate has been going on, and we know that people are dealing with anxieties and stresses and depression outside of COVID, but with the social climate going on, do you feel like people have become a lot more fearful and deal with stress more because of maybe their feeling of lack of protection or some other things that have been going on in their lives that have been forcing people to make certain decisions when it's concerning like that gun thing?
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, like some people, it's not bad people that's making those decisions, but it's because of fear.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like, because I'm not going to say that gun control wasn't an issue before the pandemic, but
Mm-hmm.
I know based on looking at the news during COVID, like once they opened up the city, it was almost like World War II again.
Mm-hmm.
So do we feel like because of what's now has been broadcast socially, now people, because of fear, are acting based on something that they may be dealing with mentally and not being able to cope?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can we say that maybe they're coping, they're properly coping, so it's kind of, I guess, dealing with people's mental in a bad way?
Mm-hmm. I can see that. And I can see that. I can see that along with, with COVID, I think there's also a lot of loneliness. I think, you know, there is the fear, but there's also, in some cases, a lot of loneliness. In some cases, it's the exact opposite, where there are so many people who are living in one house and they have to cope with that, you know. And then, dealing with issues within your own community and maybe your own neighborhood. So, yeah, I can see that.
On to another question, because we can go all night with this one
Mhm.
about guns, because I have a lot of friends who believe in carrying a gun and all of those other things, and I've had some conversations with people about certain things that's going on. But I think I want to ask this question because I think I was talking to someone and they were sharing with me that there were some things that happened to them, and I think we talked about it, those trauma triggers,
Mhm.
something that happened to them while they were younger, and so now they're at a point of age where they're starting to deal with it, and there are some feelings that come with it, and a lot of it is like a depression or anxieties or stresses. What advice do you give to someone who's dealing with those trauma triggers, who's trying to figure out how to properly cope with it, but also trying to figure out a way to detox themselves of it so they won't have to deal with it anymore?
That's a good question. I would say that that person should reach out and find someone to talk to. That would be my go-to. Of course, I'm a therapist, so that's what I would say. I would say because we can't undo what happened to us. What happened to us happened to us, and but we can find ways to deal with what happened to us and to move forward. And sometimes that means, when those feelings come back, sometimes that means we have to deal with those feelings. Some people can deal with those feelings by reaching out to family members or friends. And sometimes you might need to look at a professional for professional help.
Dr. Bordnick?
No, I think I think there's so much going on in the world right now. When you have, Dr. Hayes and myself, who are licensed clinical social workers, we've seen a lot in our careers. A little secret, even we are trying to figure out the world right now. And we work with other folks, and we're confused. We're confused with what we're seeing on TV. This pandemic, we always look for meaning and trying to think about it. There's no end to the pandemic right now. You think, I talked to someone recently that people are extremely anxious, and I think it's because they can't contextualize this pandemic with what's going on, right? You see, there's no end point, right? We're hearing all these things, but a hurricane, a storm, a tornado comes through, you see it, you're impacted by it, you're traumatized, it goes away and the sun comes out. Right now, we have no endpoint. We have no sun. And so people are constantly in this state of flux, not knowing what's going on, and then are inundated every day with the numbers. We have this many cases. Well, how do you say, is that good or bad? Are we going in the right direction or going the wrong direction? I think people are confused. I think a lot of the messages that you saw coming from the leadership in the country, and I don't do politics. However, when rational people are telling us, don't wear a mask, this isn't good, but scientists are telling us this is the best way to do it. People are trying to listen and understand what to do. And these mixed messages cause more anxiety, more stress. And then take all of that, which was happening, and then seeing George Floyd murdered by police while they were being filmed is just another layer of people going, we've seen this before, it's happening again, and everything else coming together, as Dr. Hayes said. People are watching and people are looking now and are having the time to really digest a lot of this. And my hope is that people are now going to also continue on, that this isn't just another murder that takes place by police officers on camera, that this leads to some systemic change. And I think this is, like I said earlier, an inflection point. And we are all going through the pandemic right now, and everybody's being inflected by the systemic racism and everything. And I'm hoping this leads to more dialogue, and this conversation and action keeps going and keeps continuing on and doesn't stop until we see real change. So our kids and grandchildren and folks are not carrying the same signs that they're carrying in the protests now, 50 years from now.
Yes, I was just going to say that was an excellent point, because you made a point about the systemic issues, and so the systemic issues that we're talking about, they go across healthcare, they go across police brutality issues, economics, housing issues, and you are seeing that now. You are seeing each of those things being addressed through protest and through conversation and through court hearings and all of that, because now we are at a place now that we cannot ignore the fact that these things are systemic and that these issues affect Black and brown people more than they affect other people. So when we talk about COVID was so traumatic because in the first few days of COVID, more Black people died, older Black people, young Black people, Zulu members. You had all of these people dying in the early part of COVID, and it was like a death knocking on your door. I had two relatives that I lost throughout that period myself, and it was just like, oh my God, what's next? So we understand, exactly. And when I would see on the news that it would say, oh, it's poverty, I'm like, no, it's not poverty, it's race. Because my relatives were not impoverished, but they were definitely Black men, and so, we have to look at that. So I was looking at another article today that said COVID surpasses the issue of poverty. We have to be confronted with the idea that there are health disparities in the United States of America that directly affect Black people. And we can't close our eyes to it anymore.
It's perfect that Mr. Patrick said what he said, because he said something about with kids and all of those other things. He said he talked about it's not coming out. I'm tongue tied right now and I hate it. But systemic, there we go.
Yes.
Systemic racism, and he talked about children. Let me ask this question, because we're preparing. Well, we don't know what's getting ready to happen with the school year. And this picture of kids getting ready to go back to school is kind of looking kind of bleak, because I've heard it from both sides of the spectrum. Dr. Hayes know I work for Head. You guys know I work for Head Start. And people have been making jokes about it on Facebook. One of the jokes was, the school that Donald Trump's son goes to won't be starting school.
Right.
But kids in the urban neighborhoods will be going back to school. And I don't want to say it plays on race, because there are not just Black and brown kids that are going to school in urban neighborhoods. You have some Caucasian kids, some Asian kids that are going back to school. So how are kids going to deal with these stresses of understanding COVID, but yet also have to go in dealing with race? Because we have kids that are learning race now, and they weren't taught race the same way that some people were. Now they're learning it from social media. And social media is painting a different picture of racism and social injustice compared to sitting down and having that conversation with the parent. So how is this going to impact children moving forward?
I think it already has. And again, we're seeing disparities in systemic racism in education. When we think about when all of the schools closed overnight, a big assumption was made that kids going home had technology, had internet, had Wi-Fi, and they would be able to log into school. That was the most preposterous thing I've ever heard in my life, and a fantasy that significantly impacted communities and due to systemic racism. And if you don't have internet connection, and how are you providing the school to your child that they're supposed to get? And we have a whole group of kids out there across New Orleans, across the state, around the country, that under that basic assumption missed essentially a half year of school. And who is talking about that? I can tell you, I've heard nobody. I've heard no news stories. Why? Because due to systemic racism and impacts, people are not going to bring it up. And that's the questions we need to raise. And now going back into school, purely it's for economic reasons. Let's get the kids back, because the science is telling us something different, depending upon the community you're in. And I will, it's almost in the cards that impacted communities that impacted harder, those families are going to experience the same systemic issues And the pandemic is only making it worse and magnifying it. And I remember I was doing a news interview, and one of the interviewers asked me about, well, yes, you see that the pandemic and COVID is having a higher impact in the Black communities and affecting people of color at higher rates. And I stopped for a minute and I said, why are you making that an issue now? If you thought that a pandemic was not going to have a significant impact due to the systemic racism in the healthcare system and the health disparities that have existed for 30 or 40 years, why wasn't that a news story 30 or 40 years ago and been on the news every single night? It's great to talk about it because the pandemic is, a newsworthy thing. Bring it up and do your listeners and do our society a favor and talk about the health disparities, because that's where all of this started. And again, it's rooted in systemic racism in our healthcare system. I'm getting charged up about this because it is rooted issues that need to be solved. And if Fortna and I went to go see the medical community right now, we would be treated differently. It's not poverty. It's not this. It's how we're perceived in that system. And it has nothing to do with money. And you'll see that that's a common myth that everyone says, oh, it's poverty that's negatively impacting. Yes, that has an impact. But when you have two different people from different backgrounds going into a hospital or even a banking system, and they're treated differently, that's a systemic problem that is always negatively impacting communities of color.
Wow. That was a mouthful.
Sorry, it's what we see is bigotry as racism. We see that, and people are outraged and should be by bigotry. But the underlying evil force behind that is systemic racism. And if we don't deal with that, it's easy to tear down a sign or bigotry or call someone out or film. What is the term everyone's being on Facebook? The Karens of the world, right? However, that's easy to show people and to do outrage, but behind that is systemic racism. And those are the forces that are causing more negative impacts on communities of color than bigotry itself, because those are the things that are causing these disparities.
And I think one thing that is a problem with all of this is that in our history books, the true history of America has been omitted, eliminated, or changed, so that the true history of America, for lack of a better word, has been whitewashed. And it is just, when you learn certain things, I was lucky to have my parents at the kitchen table. That's how I learned things. I went to a little grammar school where one of the owner and principal of the school was a civil rights activist, and we'd have to sit and listen to the MLK records and Marian Anderson, and she would talk about all of these things. But I was lucky to have that. And once I went from there to my high school, which I will not name, I was told that, the slaves were pretty happy and okay. And, they were like family and they were fine and they didn't really want to leave. And so that's what the high school taught me. Thank God I learned what I learned in grammar school. And so when you look at what people are taught or not taught, and then when you find out the true history of America, that's enough to make you a little angry. I'll tell you the truth. When I went to college to Loyola, I took many Black history classes. I mean, lots, because I was challenged to do so. And when you really learn the history of America, it really can change you. And so I think it's so important if we are going to fight for something, to fight for that, to fight for the true history of America to be taught in our schools. Because so many of our kids do not see themselves in history books. And they question, where do I come from and where do I fit in? And that shouldn't be.
Yeah, and I think it's 100% on point, Dr. Hayes. And most people don't know me, that know my family. I come from a multiracial family. My wife is Mexican, and my children are Chinese. And I will tell you, it doesn't matter. These forces of evil impact us all. When my daughters, who all have Chinese names, because that is important, that's part of who they are. Each one of their names has meaning. When teachers refuse to call my kids by their Chinese names,
Mhm.
not because they're hard to pronounce, I'm sorry. That is an attack upon them and their culture. And that is not just happening to Chinese people, it's happening to communities of color. And these are people that are doing this to our kids and having to try to explain something as simple as a name, which is everything to people, and it's who we are, it's how we identify. That is, if we can't get that right, what the hell are we doing?
Mhm.
In trying to figure out, I told people I should be worried my oldest is going to go away to college next year. And I should be worried about her getting pregnant. I should be worried about overdose or drugs or alcohol. You know what I lie awake at night thinking about? Someone accusing her of stealing secrets as a Chinese engineering student. Someone calling her, saying she's infected with the Chinese flu. And then also dealing with issues of being a woman in a scientific field. Do we really want to put up and tolerate with that type of situation? I can tell you that's not a world that I want to be in. I want a world that's going to be accepting and kind, and that may be pie in the sky, but damn it, I will fight for that every day. But it still starts with systemic racism, because even with Chinese in this country, that goes back 100 years of people being treated poorly in systemic issues, and it exists. And until we start addressing these issues, we're never going to go anywhere forward. And this is exactly what John Lewis fought for. And
Mhm.
it was undoing the systemic racism that impacts us all. I don't care who you are, it impacts us all. And it needs to change.
Absolutely.
You said something last week, and we were talking about it. And it's something that I've seen and noticed firsthand on how they treat children based on race and certain things that they do. Um, like a white kid gets privileged to more things, or Asian kids get privileged to more. Like Mr. Patrick said, the stigma for Asian children is that they're good in math. But he was saying how Fenwa has some issues that prevent her from being a part of that status quo, that stigma of what her race is. And you know, I'm starting to realize that. Well, I've been realizing, but it's almost as if and somebody and Amanda just put it. Amanda just said our kids are thoughts of the past, or thought to pass the test. They're running their schools like businesses, and now they're using our kids as pawns to get funding. It's crazy that now we have kids that get, I guess I don't want to say priority treatment, but better treatment than others. It's like if okay, my kid goes to the same school that your kid goes to, and our kids both have the same mental issues. Which kid are they going to help first? Are they going to help your kid first, or they're going to help our kid first, my kid first? And it's like, as children, they don't see the things that adults see.
Mhm.
So they, like, some kids don't know that they're getting preferential treatment compared to others.
Mhm.
But once they get older, they start to see it. So it was a good point that you brought that up. With how things are going in these schools and how things are going in life. But I think where it becomes crazy, because I have some friends that went to Tulane, and some of my friends said, based on, like, their education, they felt like they had to work harder in the classrooms compared to some of their Caucasian counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
Is that I don't is that the type of world that we live in? So to the point that we have to, it's like not just black kids are fighting that, but you have some other kids that are fighting that stigma. Like you say, Fang, why has to fight the stigma that based on the Asian, she's great in math or technology? Like, is that the world that we are raising kids in, and how do we obliterate that stigma so that way kids won't have to deal with that moving forward?
That's a huge question. Again, you ask really good questions, but I will tell you, I will tell you that I was always taught that I had to be 10 times better than. And I was always taught that the expectation was that I was better than. And, and so that is a message that I think Black kids get from the beginning of their school years, is that you have to, in order for you to compete, you can't just be the status quo, you have to be the best, or you have to be excellent at what you do. And so I think the message that you get from your Tulane friends is probably a message that most Black kids feel going through universities, not just Tulane, Loyola, UNO. I've heard that about UNO over and over again. That the supports that you get is different. The support that you get in the university system is different. I can say to you that Tulane, in the last few years, has made great steps and great efforts at changing that. And you can look at the webpage and you can see it. You can look at TSSW's webpage and see it. I think it starts with the leadership changing how they see it and then trickling it down. And in any system, systems are very difficult to change, because when you have people embedded in systems, they want to do things the same way they've been doing things. And so that is a huge challenge that I think Tulane, and I'm talking, the dean should be talking about this, but I can tell you as a former student that I can see that there are real changes that are being made, or at least attempted to be made at Tulane. Now, will they stick? Systems are really difficult. That's all I can tell you. But I think if the leadership sticks to it and makes changes from the top down and the bottom up, that those changes might stick.
Dean?
Yeah, we talking back. No, I think Dr. Hayes is right. It's again, it's easy to fix the things on the surface across any institution. Going back to talking about the school systems, you're right. There's systemic issues that exist when a teacher sees two students.
Mm-hmm.
There are implicit bias based on what they see on the outside, rather than understanding the inside of what's going on with that child. And then couple on, as we talked about last week, and I have my daughter's permission to talk about this. She actually wants me to talk about it, to talk for stigma, to decrease stigmas. So she has autism spectrum disorder and severe ADHD. And she's judged because she's Chinese. And I shared this story last week with Bordnick. And I remember she has dyscalculia, which is problems with numbers as well as dyslexia, and she wasn't doing it good in math. And I'll never forget, the teacher was sitting down, and it didn't matter that I was a professor at a university and my wife is a scientist. We're both PhDs. It did not matter, because the systemic bias that existed was, well, she should be good in math. I said, well, why? I just started playing along then because I knew where this was going. So I said, well, why should she be good in math? She has dyscalculia. Well, you know. I said, no, I don't know. I sit there at the dinner table with her. And it was because she is Chinese. It was this stigma that a teacher in an elementary school, now imagine that same teacher looking at another child, looking at their background, looking at their race, and already has judged that child's ability. That's systemic. That is something that is going to harm that child and how that teacher interacts with that child. And that's going to impact everything. The attention they pay with the child, the attention they pay to the parents, which parents are getting more attention. These are, again, I keep going back to these systemic issues. Bigotry is easy to see. It's the visible signs of racism, but these systemic issues, which are much more powerful and negative, have to be addressed. And it's educating those teachers to not judge. We use that term, judge a book by our cover, right? That happens all the time, and it doesn't matter, and it impacts your kid. Imagine being my daughter, being told you should be good at math. Right. I can tell you, she came home and said, I'm stupid. And I said, what do you mean you're stupid? Well, I'm not good at math, and I should be good at math. We had a long talk that night, and I was about ready to go call the news media. So I'm like, get people out. I mean, this is wrong. You make a child feel bad because of your biases, and it's not something she can do, right? And so I think that's what we talk about is a lot of our school systems, and we're not training our teachers, and we're not addressing these issues. I think a lot of times we're afraid to, or have these difficult conversations. But if we don't, this happens every day, and our kids are reaching negativity and are getting treated poorly, and they're being held back, and they're being classified, and they're being medicated, not because they need to be medicated, but because of bias.
Mm-hmm. And she articulated it. She articulated what many kids feel when they have that experience. I'm stupid. Well, we know she's not stupid, but she said how that teacher made her feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to this day, she's still, I will tell you, at the dinner table the other day, we were having some conversation, and she goes, well, I'm stupid. I damn near lost it. I'll be honest with you. I'm again, that impact that teacher had on that child is still there. And, again, she lives with a father who's the dean of social work, right? We know how to have these, and the therapist. And again, it doesn't matter. These things negatively impact our kids. And it's there. I think Fortna, Amanda had a very good point in the thing. If you want to talk about that, that happens, and what she's talking about is real. If you want to read what she wrote in her comments.
Amanda said that's how they do it in the health system. Can they always say black people are strong and can take pain, but we need help too?
Right.
In the health system, I'll talk about it, and I know the pain she's referring to, but when we were talking about, if Fortin and I both go to the health system and we're both say we're in pain, more than likely I'm going to get a drug for my pain, and Fortin is not going to. Going in with the same symptoms and this and that. Tell me what that's all about. Mm-hmm. Implicit bias, systemic racism in a system that you're treated differently with the same conditions, the same paying, the same insurance, whatever you've got. That is downright insane when you think about it. I get charged up about these things because you see it all the time, and these are the things that are the most difficult to change. But if we don't talk about them and we don't have conversations like this and get real with it and say, this has got to stop. Bigotry's there. We see that. But these systemic things that are behind the scenes, a colleague of mine, the Dean of Public Health, Tom Levis, has a wonderful website and actually a video and resources called The Skin You're In. And it's a wonderful series. And there are all these health myths he talks about that are systemic. And it's a great read, and it's to help educate all of us on these myths that people think about with health disparities and health equity. I just throw that out there because I was sharing that with some folks the other day, and it's just great set of resources.
And I'll just add that one little piece, which is the infant mortality rate, is also something that is systemic, and that there are disparities, and it is not about poverty. It is actually down racial lines, and women, no matter what their socioeconomic class, have a higher infant mortality rate and a higher death rate at birth than other women. So these are all issues that we have to start dealing with and not close our eyes to.
This has been a great conversation, and we could probably go on about this probably till about 10, 12 o'clock tonight. But y'all, we are going to have to cut this conversation short in hopes that maybe we can get Dr. Hayes and Dr. Bordnick back on next week, because y'all, they touched on so much tonight, and I just believe, y'all, that they actually have started the fire that's going to ignite some of us to move forward and make some better decisions, not just mentally, but socially. So you guys, if you guys are available, I do want to invite you guys back next week. If you are available. If you aren't available, I do understand. 9 times out of 10, Mr. Patrick is probably going to be available. We know Dr. Hayes has we know your schedule is probably maybe a little bit different, but we do want to finish this conversation if we can next week, because we have a lot of people that have been commenting, and I think it's some questions that we really need to answer. And I think next week, if we can, I think we ought to deal with it from the standpoint of dealing with this generation, these kids.
Mm-hmm.
And like you say, we want to deal with the infant mortality rate, because I think that's something right now that we really have to talk about concerning racism and just this environment that we're dealing with. So, Dr. Hayes, if you're available next week, I'll definitely reach out to you and find out. If not, I'm going to reel Dr. Bordnick in and see if I can get on. And maybe next week we may, if you can't come on, we'll see if we can get Lady Bordnick, my other friend Allison.
I like that, Lady Bordnick.
Yeah, Lady Bordnick.
I like that.
Her on and let her do some talking, because I do believe she has some things that she could definitely add to this as well, from another side. But we want to keep this conversation going. You guys have sparked my interest. You guys have actually stirred me, and I thank you guys for your time on tonight. You guys have definitely helped a lot of people on tonight, and I'm more than sure my inbox is going to probably go crazy with saying how you guys did, because I was reading some inboxes, and they love the conversation. I mean, people are like, that's what needs to be said. Even Quantika LaShine said, she's like, Mr. Patrick, she's like, say it, Mr. Pat, because you had made a comment, and she was basically, saying thank you guys for sharing what you shared. You guys definitely impacted this generation. So thank you. So y'all,
Thank you.
No problem. We're gonna have to cut it off, y'all. But we will be back again next week. We're going to put these pieces back together. And if it's just us two, if it's just us three, as long as the puzzle gets done.
Yes.
So thank all of you for joining us on tonight. And until next week, I'm Fortunate K. Barnes, along with Dr. Bordnick and Dr. Hayes. You guys have a wonderful and blessed night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.